You expect stone and silence when you think of Angkor Wat. Precise blocks stacked into towers, bas-reliefs frozen like old newspapers, a place where the past is neatly catalogued and labeled by guides in matching polo shirts. But when you stand at the edge of its moat and feel the damp air press a secret against your skin, the neatness begins to peel away. The world's largest religious monument, built by hands that did not sign their work, sits on a ground that still refuses to tell the whole truth. What was built with such ambition that an entire river system was bent to serve it? How did an empire vanish from its own capital without leaving a single full explanation? These are not just archaeological footnotes. They are living questions that tug at the edges of what we think we know about human ingenuity and human collapse. I want to take you into those questions, not with dusty certainties, but with the sort of wonder that insists on both skepticism and imagination. We'll stand together on the causeways at dawn, listen to the city wake, and ask the blunt question: how much of Angkor's story remains beyond the reach of our instruments? I promise you revelations that are both grand and quietly unnerving, lost networks of water that rival modern engineering, bas-reliefs that seem to map cosmic knowledge in stone, and gaps in the record so persistent they invite legends of giants, curses, and hidden chambers. This is not a treasure hunt for sensational headlines. It's a slow, cinematic walk through rubble and memory, an attempt to feel how a civilization thought of itself and then, mysteriously, stopped. So keep your skepticism sharpened and your imagination lit. Some of what follows will be well supported by data, some of it will be competing hypotheses that refuse to reconcile. And some of it will be the kind of detail, an alignment, a missing inscription, an inexplicable watercourse, that has kept scholars awake at night. Picture fog clinging to the fields. Hear drums echoing through the night. Imagine a carved face turning its gaze toward a temple that has outlived the priests who once supervised its ceremonies. We're going to walk that foggy trail together. The first thing to say is that Angkor is not a single site, it's a city region. From the 9th through the 15th centuries, the Khmer people built a network of temples, roads, reservoirs, and settlements across a landscape that could be measured in hundreds of square kilometers, an engineered heartland that supported one of the most powerful pre-modern polities on Earth. The temples are the visible grammar of that civilization, but the grammar was supported by a hydraulic punctuation, an intricate system of barays, canals, dikes, and reservoirs that could store and move immense volumes of water. Some of those features are still visible. The moat that cradles Angkor Wat itself, the western baray with its reflective mirror of water, the laterite banks and sluices whose exact functioning continues to be debated. What makes these features mysterious is not that we can see them, it's that when researchers try to explain them, why they were built in particular geometries, how they were operated, how they failed, the answers multiply instead of narrowing. Drought models say one thing. Paleoclimatology says another. Inscriptions boast of kings and gods. The soil underneath whispers of collapsed foundations and abandoned fields. Still, for all the evidence, the basic rhythm of Angkor's rise and fall retains an ambiguity that refuses a tidy ending. Picture yourself walking the stone causeway at dawn, mist pooling where the moat meets the sky, and imagine the people who once crossed the same stretch under palanquins and banners. Now, let's be fair, the Khmer left us monuments for which we can read many of the lines. But here's where it gets tricky. The spaces between the inscriptions are deep, and in those depths, whole theories live. One segment of this story we might call the hydraulic enigma. Teasing the mystery into one sentence, Angkor's waterworks rival modern canals, but we still can't agree on whether they were primarily agricultural infrastructure or political theater. It's an odd paradox. On the one hand, there are barays so large their surfaces read like lakes from the sky. On the other, the very design of some reservoirs seems to defy pure irrigation logic. The Khmer were clearly masters of stone and earth. Massive tanks like the West Baray, rectangular and nearly 2 kilometers across in places, held back water behind engineered dikes. The size and scale are staggering, tens or hundreds of millions of cubic meters of water stored across the landscape, feeding rice fields and, presumably, the people required to staff courts and armies. The dates associated with this hydraulic bloom cluster around the 9th to 13th century CE, a period of intense urbanization and monumental temple building. Excavations and LIDAR surveys show radiating networks of canals and embanked fields surrounding the temples, evidence, at first glance, of an integrated agricultural system designed to maximize rice yields. But when hydrologists model the flow, they find anomalies. Some canals run uphill in places, others seem to connect basins without clear drainage logic. There are sluice gates and stone-lined channels whose capacity exceeds simple irrigation needs. One prominent theory argues we are seeing a central authority using water as a medium of control. By dictating where water flowed, kings controlled land value, taxation, and symbolic relationships between temples and the cosmos. Another theory insists the water system was resilient, adaptive engineering meant to buffer against seasonal variation, monsoon floods and dry season scarcity alike, explaining the redundancy and apparent excess. Yet a third suggests ceremonial priorities. Barays reflected the cosmic ocean and were as much architectural metaphors for the Hindu cosmology of Mount Meru as they were functional reservoirs. Still, for all the evidence, we cannot replicate precisely how the sluices were operated at scale across centuries, nor can we fully reconcile paleoclimate records showing erratic monsoon patterns with the timing of temple construction and urban sprawl. Imagine standing on a raised embankment as a monsoon cloud rolls over, hearing the sluices creak and stones shift. You can feel the tension between a society dependent on predictable water and the reality of an unpredictable sky. We still don't know whether Angkor's hydraulic system was the city's crown jewel or the stone that eventually tripped it. If the hydraulic system is a technical riddle, then the bas-reliefs are an intellectual riddle. One sentence. The bas-reliefs of Angkor speak in a language of gods, battles, and boats that seems to encode lost knowledge. Walk the galleries of Angkor Wat and you encounter a continuous narrative frieze. Tales of the churning of the ocean, imperial conquests, and mythic kings, carved with a precision that suggests craftsmen who were also storytellers and recorders. But the reliefs do more than recount myths. They present processions, ships with unfamiliar rigging, and scenes that some scholars read as detailed maps of trade networks. There are depictions of what look like long-distance merchants, exotic animals, and implements whose analogues appear in other corners of Asia. The Khmer were part of a broader Indianized world, Sanskrit and Pali loanwords, Hindu and Buddhist iconography, and maritime links to Java, the Indian subcontinent, and possibly even China. Precise dates for the panels align with the 12th century reign of Suryavarman II in the case of the main Angkor Wat reliefs, but the visual vocabulary extends both earlier and later. Now, here's where interpretation becomes contentious. Some historians read the boats carved into stone as evidence of a navy, organized, state-sponsored maritime expeditions that projected power and traded for luxury goods. Others argue these are symbolic, ritualistic images intended to align the king with cosmic journeys rather than literal records of commerce. Complicating matters further are fragments of inscriptions and foreign artifacts, beads, ceramics, metalwork, found in peripheral sites that point to long-distance exchange. Still, the distribution of foreign goods does not always match the narratives carved in stone. In other words, the reliefs might be both propaganda and ethnography, mixing real voyages with mythic destiny. Picture yourself tracing your fingers along a channel of stone where soldiers and merchants mingle, and imagine a procession where duty and commerce blur. The carved faces do not tell us the whole truth. They hint at a network of exchange whose mechanisms and scale we only partially reconstruct. We still don't know how far those maritime and overland routes truly extended, nor the degree to which Angkor's elites depended on foreign imports for their ritual economy. Another mystery sits in the realm of labor and logistics. One sentence. How did tens of thousands of workers move and assemble sandstone blocks, sometimes carved with near incredible precision, across hundreds of kilometers? The common image is of laborers hauling stone across rivers on rafts, of gangs moving blocks on sledges, a procession of human muscle and clever levers. There is truth there. Inscriptions and local traditions speak of corvée labor, temporary obligations of peasants required to serve the state. Yet the logistics puzzle deepens when you consider the quarries. The principal sandstone for Angkor Wat came from the Kulin Hills some 25 to 50 kilometers to the northeast, depending on the quarry. transporting tens of thousands of cubic meters of dense sandstone over such distances, with heavy carving performed either before or after transport, require not just labor but management, food logistics, and planning on an industrial scale. Estimates of workforce size vary wildly. Some archaeologists suggest seasonal mobilization of tens of thousands, others argue for smaller professionalized crews. Then there's the question of precision. Some blocks interlock so well that you cannot slide a knife blade between them. Some reliefs display a carving finesse that suggests tools and techniques we are still trying to reconstruct. Hypotheses include the presence of specialist guilds, long apprenticeship traditions, and perhaps knowledge of lubricants or rollers lost to time. There are even fringe claims of lost technologies, metallic lubricants, advanced pulleys, or external artisans from distant lands, yet these often fall short without solid evidence. Picture a night camp at the end of a quarry road, torches, the smell of river mud, men tuning ropes and resting after a day of hauling. The human cost and organizational skill implied by the stones are clear, but the precise social mechanisms, how labor was coerced, how specialists were paid, how supply chains were maintained through monsoon seasons, remain partly shrouded. We still don't know whether Angkor's monumental projects were driven primarily by a mass mobilization of peasants or a class of skilled, semi-permanent artisans, and what that difference implies for the structure of Khmer society. The next question takes us into the palace and the politics of identity. One sentence: the inscriptions boast divine kings and celestial mandates, but the demographic footprint suggests a complex, multi-ethnic urban fabric. The Khmer state was heavily Indianized in religion and court culture, yet the population that sustained it included local Austroasiatic speakers, Malay traders, Cham people from what is now central Vietnam, and possibly others. Inscriptions carved in Sanskrit and Khmer extol kings as Devaraja, god kings who incarnated the world mountain. Temples were built as sacred mountains, rituals were cosmic in scale. Yet material remains, pottery types, burial practices at peripheral sites, dietary remains, suggest a more heterogeneous day-to-day life. The city was both cosmopolitan and hyper-hierarchical. Political power appears to have been centralized in courtly institutions that claimed divine sanction, but at ground level the landscape was a mosaic of villages, markets, and craft districts where identities intermingled. Some scholars posit that Angkor's elites used religion and monumental architecture to bind diverse groups into a single political project. Others argue that local autonomy and ethnic diversity were more resilient, and that the Khmer identity we project backward is partly a modern construction applied to a plural past. Picture a market scene in the shadow of a temple, vendors from different linguistic backgrounds trading fish, rice, and beads, while priests march past in ceremonial garb. The spectacle of unity masks ongoing negotiations of identity, allegiance, and survival. We still don't know how easily the state could reconcile local identities with imperial demands over centuries of environmental and political pressure. Then there is the darker, more sensational set of legends that surround the site. One sentence: stories of cursed stones, giant skeletons in hidden chambers, and vanished priests persist in both local folklore and fringe literature. For centuries, local oral traditions have spoken of stones that cry when moved, of guardian spirits bound to particular blocks, and of archaeological misfortunes visited on those who disrespect a temple's sanctity. Western explorers in the 19th and early 20th centuries added their own layers of myth, tales of skeletons as tall as trees, of subterranean vaults filled with treasure, and of secret rituals glimpsed in half-remembered notebooks. Modern archaeologists treat such tales cautiously, often as cultural expressions rather than literal accounts, but they also recognize that folklore sometimes preserves kernels of lost memory. The idea that certain areas were sacred and off-limits, for example, could reflect institutional practices of restricted access. Fringe narratives, giants who carved the stones, curses that befall excavation crews, are sensational and rarely supported by evidence, yet they shape popular imagination and occasionally influence local attitudes toward conservation and looting. Picture a villager whispering a warning at dusk: "Do not dig near the old banyan, the spirits do not like it." That whisper is a form of knowledge, social, symbolic, and historically layered, even when it is not literally true. We still don't know which parts of these stories are metaphor, which parts preserve faint echoes of ancient prohibitions, and which parts were invented by travelers seeking mystery. Finally, there is the unresolved question of Angkor's decline. One sentence. After centuries of grandeur, Angkor receded and hollowed out, but the causes of that decline remain contested. The city did not vanish in a single cataclysm so much as contract and transform across the 14th and 15th centuries. External pressures, Theravada Buddhist reform, shifting trade routes favoring coastal ports, and increasing attacks from Ayutthaya, are all implicated. Internal pressures, soil exhaustion, failure of hydraulic infrastructure, and elite infighting, also appear in reconstructions. Paleoclimate studies reveal episodes of severe drought interspersed with intense monsoon flooding in the 14th and 15th centuries, suggesting that the very water systems that once enabled Angkor could have worked against it when weather patterns became erratic. But causality is slippery. Did droughts unravel social order, or did institutional decay render the system less resilient to climatic shocks? Did foreign raids finish what environmental stress began, or were they opportunistic responses to a polity already in retreat? Imagine the last procession down a causeway, banners trailing, the king's retinue small compared to former glories, as priests of a different faith pack icons into boats and leave for safer shores. The image is cinematic, but the documentary evidence resists a single narrative. We still don't know which factor was decisive, and perhaps no single factor was. Instead, decline appears to have been a complex interplay of human choices and natural forces. At this point, we have crossed a threshold. We have temperature readings from sediments, carved panels that insist on being narratives, and physical infrastructure that demands engineering explanations. Yet the full story remains porous. There are places where our best techniques, LIDAR mapping, radiocarbon dating, isotopic analysis, illuminate detail, and places where they only sharpen the questions. Angkor Wat stands as an invitation to keep asking. In the next part of this journey, we will go deeper into each of these mysteries, reopening the hydraulic puzzle with the latest landscape archaeology, reading the bas-reliefs with a new attentiveness to trade and ritual, reconstructing labor regimes from scattered inscriptions, and examining the folklore and decline with both rigor and empathy. But for now, as the sun breaks the horizon and gilds the 5 towers, take a moment to imagine you, walking slowly along an ancient causeway, the moat reflecting the sky, and the stones whispering unsolved equations about human ambition and human fragility. Keep that image with you, because it is both a literal and a metaphorical doorway to a civilization whose secrets we are only beginning to pry open. We still don't know everything, and in that admission lies our greatest gift, an invitation to keep digging. Some secrets still lie just beneath your feet. The water at Angkor is both mirror and mystery, and to stand beside the great barays is to face an engineering question that reads like a myth written in stone and earth. Imagine, if you will, a flat, wet plain stretching for miles, punctuated by embanked rectangles of black water that glitter like onyx mirrors under a tropical sun. Picture the West Baray, an immense rectangle of water that, in some places, spans several kilometers across, its surface sometimes so calm that the 5 towers of Angkor Wat float inverted in its reflection. Now stretch that image across the 9th to the 13th century CE, when kings like Jayavarman II and Suryavarman II were not only commissioning temples but orchestrating the landscape itself into a living machine. The Khmer engineers carved out basins, heaped soil into dikes, cut channels that ran in graceful arcs across the plains, and built stone-lined gates where water could be held or released with regulatory intent. At small scales, the technology seems straightforward: earthworks, sluices, and channels that capture monsoon rains and distribute them where needed. But when you scale up to the regional landscape and try to reconstruct the annual choreography of water, where it pooled, when it was released, how it fed rice paddies, you encounter an uncomfortable number of paradoxes. For starters, the total capacity of the reservoir system, tens, maybe hundreds, of millions of cubic meters of stored water when you add all the barays together, suggests an ability to regulate flows and support population densities far above subsistence. But models that take into account evaporation rates, seepage through laterite soils, and the irregularity of monsoon rains find that keeping those reservoirs functional required meticulous timing and maintenance. That implies a bureaucratic apparatus and a workforce dedicated not just to building temples but to running a hydraulic economy year after year. The inscriptions praise kings and record gifts to temples, but they rarely lay out operational manuals for how sluices were opened at dawn or how canals were dredged after the floods. So archaeologists look to the earth itself. LIDAR surveys thrown across the Cambodian plain reveal networks of embanked dikes and straight channels radiating from temple centers like spokes from a wheel. Satellite imagery picks out soil discolorations where ancient irrigation furrows still chart the ground beneath forest canopies. Radiocarbon dates from organic material trapped in canal sediments cluster around the same centuries that the great temples were raised. Taken together, the physical and chronologic signals suggest coordination, some central plan knitting temples, reservoirs, and fields into a single productive system. But here's where it gets tricky. Hydrologists who build computational models of the system find inconsistencies between the hypothesized intent and the physical reality. Some channels appear to flow against the gradient you'd expect for simple gravity-fed irrigation. Some sluice placements make sense only if water levels at two distinct basins were coordinated precisely across seasons. One group of scholars reads these oddities and sees redundancy and resilience. The Khmer built extra channels and overflow paths to avoid catastrophic failure during extreme floods and to provide insurance against drought. Another group sees ceremonial geometry and cosmology embedded in infrastructure. A baray is not only a reservoir but a cosmic ocean, a symbolic flat sea that mirrors the king's Mount Meru, and so the exact alignment and scale of certain tanks reflect ritual priorities as much as agricultural ones. A third, more radical, interpretation posits that the waterworks function primarily as a mechanism of political control, by monopolizing access to irrigation, deciding who received water and when. The central authority could extract labor, levy taxes, and hold sway over peripheral communities. If water distribution determined the ability to plant rice on time, then controlling the sluices was power in the most literal sense. It determined who ate and who starved. Still, for all that debate, we lack a complete blueprint. When archaeologists look for the physical evidence of institutional control, storage facilities that might hold food for laborers, administrative buildings with records, barracks for canal crews, they find fragments and hints but rarely a continuous ledger. Oral histories and Khmer language chronicles nod to corvée labor and palace projects, but those accounts are cloaked in rhetoric, glorious kings mobilizing the populace for sacred work. We still do not have a step-by-step operational archive that tells us exactly how annual maintenance was funded, how labor was requisitioned without collapsing the food supply, or how the system adapted to decades-long shifts in rainfall patterns. Now, at another level, the climate record. Paleoclimatologists, probing lake sediments and speleothem isotopes from the region, have found signals of marked variability in the monsoons starting in the 13th and 14th centuries, periods of prolonged drought punctuated by episodes of extreme rainfall. When rain became irregular, the engineering that once optimized rice production could become a liability. Reservoirs could be overfilled and breach dikes in sudden deluges, or they could sit half-empty during extended dry seasons, making irrigation impossible. This variability turns the question from how were the canals built into how resilient was the society that depended on them. It is one thing to design redundancy into an irrigation network to handle a normal rainy season. It is another to manage repeated multi-year droughts that stress food storage systems and sap the labor pool needed to maintain the very infrastructure that keeps the system alive. Some researchers model scenarios in which a sequence of poor monsoons would have increased the cost of maintenance beyond political tolerance, while others caution that polities can be much more elastic. Trade, tribute, and reorganization of land tenures can buffer environmental shocks in ways that defy simple collapse narratives. Think of the human scene in such a moment: the canals making the land fertile in a good year, then shouting and groaning as waters overflow their banks in a bad one. Workers hauling rushes and stones, kings issuing edicts about who gets what water and when, villagers gossiping about which temple has been favored by the gods this season. Picture yourself standing on the lip of a baray after a failed monsoon, Its exposed mud flats cracked like an old face, and imagine the political calculations playing out in palace rooms far away from the smell of fish drying on village racks. Another layer of complexity is revealed when we examine the construction techniques themselves. The Khmer used compacted earth, laterite, and carefully cut sandstone to build their dikes and sluices. Some of the sluice gates, like the well-preserved ones at the West Baray, are built of massive laterite blocks with a stone threshold suggesting wooden gates once slid into place. Yet wood decays. Organic mechanisms like wooden sluices vanish unless preserved in anaerobic conditions. So archaeologists triangulate. They study groove patterns, remaining attachment points, and contemporary accounts from other Southeast Asian societies that use timber engineering in similar climates. From this, reconstructions have proposed sophisticated gate systems capable of metered release, and even seasonal adjustments that shifted water from one basin to another. But because so much of the organic technology is lost and because subsequent centuries have altered the landscape, siltation, tree growth, later agricultural modifications, our reconstructions remain contested. Then there is the social dimension. If sluices were complex and required regular labor to operate, who trained the specialists? Were there hereditary classes of hydraulic engineers with knowledge passed from father to son? Or did labor pools compose this skill anew each season? Inscriptions that record temple endowments sometimes name officials responsible for water, but they do not describe training regimes or hereditary roles in detail. Yet the precision found in some infrastructure, the standardized stonework around channels, and the evident integration of channels into temple precincts argue for institutional continuity, a kind of civic engineering class whose knowledge was embedded in ritual calendars as much as in guild practice. Here, again, the imagery is powerful: priests, engineers, and laborers convening as the moon waned and the rice calendar demanded action, rituals performed to calm the waters even as men adjusted sluices beneath the same moonlight. The final knot in this enigma is a matter of scale and resilience. When modern engineers attempt to replicate the outputs of Angkor's system, how many hectares could be irrigated, how many harvests supported, they discover that the system could, in theory, sustain an urban population far greater than the village-level distributions visible in other parts of Southeast Asia at the time. That suggests a remarkable concentration of labor and wealth, a true urbanization on a scale few civilizations achieved before the industrial era. Yet paradoxically, Angkor lacks certain features typical of other contemporary urban centers: dense written bureaucracies, permanent stone housing for the mass of workers, or ubiquitous urban markets carved in stone. Instead, much of the lived environment seems to have been timber and thatch, perishable things that left little trace. This raises a provocative possibility. The hydraulic network may have been the very engine that made a dispersed, timber-built urbanism possible. Temples of stone anchored a political center, while the distributed irrigation system knit peripheral villages into a functioning urban organism. If so, the fragility of timber and soil structures in response to environmental variability becomes urgent. When water fails or floods, wooden bridges rot, palisades wash away, homes are abandoned, and the social fabric unravels. We still don't know whether Angkor's waterworks were ultimately a protective marvel, a political tool, or the Achilles heel that, under climatic pressure, led to social reconfiguration. Now turn your attention to the skin of the temples themselves, the bas-reliefs that wrap walls like tapestries of stone, and you will find a different kind of riddle, a language that is at once public monument and private code. Walk the galleries of Angkor Wat and the story unfolds in an unbroken horizontal river of figures, gods and demons locked in cosmic struggle, kings flanked by attendants, elephants, horses, soldiers, and flotillas of ships carved in such precise detail that you can almost count the oarsmen. These panels are not mere decoration, they are deliberate visual narratives that serve political, religious, and mnemonic purposes. The reliefs at Angkor Wat and nearby temples date mainly to the 12th century under Suryavarman II and subsequent phases of retouching and addition, though iconographic traditions stretch earlier into the 9th and 10th centuries and persist in later periods as styles evolve. The carvings vary in scale and technique. In some friezes, the action is compressed into a crowded parade of figures arranged in registers. In others, the carver breathes, giving a single deity the room to inhabit a full dramatic posture. When you trace the scenes of the churning of the ocean or the epic battles, you are looking at a deliberate attempt to project cosmological order onto the earthly rule of kings. Yet the reliefs do more than narrate myth. They embed details that tease historians, breeds of animals not local to the immediate plain, sailors carrying cargoes that speak of distant trade, and iconographic motifs that echo the art of Java, Kampa, and distant India. Those visual cues match material evidence, ceramics, beads, and metalwork, found elsewhere, suggesting that Angkor's visual lexicon was part of a living network of exchange. But how literal should we take these images? One theory argues for a primarily literal reading. The reliefs document actual military campaigns, diplomatic missions, and maritime expeditions, visual registers functioning like a carved chronicle. Another posits a predominantly symbolic function. The panels are ritual instruments designed to align the king's body and authority with cosmic narratives, not to report mundane trade routes. A third approach blends the two. The reliefs mix real events with mythic overlay, using familiar visual tropes to encode propaganda and civic memory. To complicate any neat reading further, some panels highlight technological detail: boats with particular bows and sails, harnesses for elephants, rows of soldiers carrying weapons whose shapes correspond to metallurgical practices of their time. Those details have sparked intense debates about the scale and nature of Angkor's maritime activities. Were the Khmer running fleets that plied the South China Sea and the Bay of Bengal, or were the ships mostly riverine and coastal, their long-distance presence limited to the ambitions of elite sponsorship rather than the economy writ large? Imagine yourself kneeling before a relief at dusk, torchlight catching the carved faces. You can almost hear the scrape of chisel as a craftsman, centuries ago, decided which line to accentuate to make a god's gaze colder or a steed's flank tauter. Now, sprinkle on top of this a mythic element. Travelers' tales and local lore sometimes claim that certain panels conceal secret inscriptions or that faces in the relief shift when the light strikes them at a particular hour. Claims that feed the imagination even if they resist empirical confirmation. We still don't know how to balance the symbolic and literal registers in a consistent interpretative method. How much of what we see is record? How much is rehearsal for ritual? And how much is propaganda meant to rewrite memory itself? From the imagery shift to the physical reality of how Angkor rose from dirt and labor, the logistics of creation is another mystery that presses against our modern intuitions. The stones did not assemble themselves, and the people who moved them left an imprint that is frustratingly partial. We can estimate volumes, tens of thousands of cubic meters of sandstone quarried, dressed, and transported, embankments of laterite and compacted earth forming dikes and platforms measured in the millions of cubic meters, and we can locate many quarries on the Kulin Massif and elsewhere, but the human choreography remains partly shadowed. Contemporary inscriptions sometimes congratulate kings for their projects, and occasionally mention the labor used, often described as gifts or obligations rendered by villages in service of the state. Ethnographic analogies with corvée systems elsewhere provide models. Seasonal obligations levied on peasants who, after harvest, were obliged to do public work. Yet the scale implied by Angkor's stone architecture strains conventional corvée models. Did the state rotate huge labor cohorts over decades, building a temple block by block as craftsmen specialized into guilds? Or was there a standing class of professional masons and engineers who lived in quasi-permanent settlements around temple precincts? The archaeological record offers hints. Concentrations of domestic debris, polished stone offcuts, and temporally clustered tool assemblages near certain temples imply prolonged occupation by specialized groups. That said, timber marketplaces and perishable housing mean that much of the living environment and its organization is simply lost to time. There are iron tools, adzes, files, and the occasional inscription naming master carvers, but the full mapping of labor organization is fragmented. To move stone at scale required more than muscle. It required food logistics, grain stores, salt, proteins for workers, plus a managerial hierarchy to schedule quarrying, transport across rivers and lowlands, carving, and final installation. A tantalizing line of inquiry has been to track isotopic signatures in human remains to see whether workers were local or moved from distant regions to work on royal projects. Early results from various programs indicate both local recruitment and long-distance movement of specialists. That hints at a mobile workforce that circulated between construction sites, perhaps incentivized or coerced at different moments. Imagine a procession of wooden rafts sliding along swollen rivers as the monsoon lifts, men singing and hauling, carved blocks lashed, and oars beating the time. There are also stories, both from colonial-era chronicles and from modern folklore, about giant teams moving stones with techniques that look like primitive cranes or ropes and pulleys. These accounts edge into sensationalism when they suggest lost mechanical knowledge or supernatural aid, but they should not be dismissed entirely, for artisan creativity sometimes leaves no trace beyond an oral memory. We still don't know the exact balance of forced labor and specialized craftsmen, nor the full logistics that sustain decades-long projects without a continuous written ledger. Move inward, into the precincts and courtly life, and you confront the question of political identity and cultural synthesis. Angkor was an imperial project that absorbed symbols, texts, and personnel from India, China, and the maritime world, yet it also grew from indigenous Austroasiatic roots. The Devaraja cult, king as god-king, often linked to Shiva or Vishnu, was the ideological glue that justified monumental projects and the redistribution of surplus. Temple inscriptions invoke divine kingship in Sanskrit formulas and ring with liturgical references, yet the daily lives of the majority, farmers, fishers, artisans, were often lived in vernacular ways that left fewer high-profile traces. The archaeological distribution of artifacts, pottery styles, and burial customs paints a mosaic of cultural interaction. Cham pottery fragments appear alongside local wares. Chinese ceramics show up in contexts suggesting trade connections rather than mere curiosity. Some scholars read this as evidence of a cosmopolitan trading polity whose elites stitched together foreign alliances as part of political strategy. Others caution that trade items can be relatively rare yet symbolically powerful, used in elite rituals and not representative of mass consumption. The tension is political as well as ethnic. How did the state integrate, or fail to integrate, peripheral groups with distinct identities? Did the temples serve to centralize religious practice and thus political loyalty, or did local cults and village-level rituals retain a degree of autonomy that complicated state demands? It's tempting to imagine Angkor as a seamless Khmer monolith, but the textures, micro-regional variations in craft styles, patchy habitation patterns, and diverse subsistence strategies suggest a far more complex social tapestry. Picture a market day where a Cham trader sells betel nut beside a Khmer potter while a monk from the south debates doctrine with a traveling guru. This is not a neat, unified state, but a negotiated world of overlapping identities. The mythic overlay thickens when local tales speak of lost tribes and hidden lineages that retreated into forests or mountains when the capital cooled. Such legends might encode real migrations or elite displacements. We still don't know how the state's ideological machinery held together such diversity over centuries, nor how shifts in that machinery contributed to social fragmentation. Then consider the stories that refuse to be pinned down by excavation, the spectral, the whispered, the folkloric. For generations, villagers around Angkor have told stories of guardian spirits bound to stones, of temples that should not be entered after sundown, and of curses pronounced by long-dead priests. Early explorers translated local warnings into wild rumors of treasure and haunted chambers. Sensationalist reports of giant skeletons discovered near temple ruins when Westerners first cleared vegetation are recurring in travelogues, though they lack corroborating osteological evidence and often rest on misinterpretation or deliberate embellishment. Still, folklore has its own evidentiary value. A warning that a site was off-limits could reflect real historical practices of ritual enclosures where only certain caste members could enter. A tale of a disappearing village might compress memories of historical population movement during times of conflict or disease. Fringe claims, giants, curses, and subterranean vaults flood popular imagination and complicate conservation. Looters and tourists guided by myth sometimes cause damage that hinders future scholarship. Equally, folklore can be a source of protective conservation. Respect for certain sites due to spiritual beliefs has preserved them from agriculture or vandalism, creating pockets where archaeology can still be performed. Imagine a fisherman pausing at a temple wall and crossing himself before casting a net. That gesture can be as important to the preservation of a site as any physical barrier. Yet the sensational stories persist. For every responsibly recorded oral tradition, there is a tabloid-ready counter-narrative. We still don't know where myth ends and memory begins in many of these tales, nor how much of that shared imaginative world might hide factual kernels that could only be accessed by combining respectful ethnography with careful excavation. Finally, the decline. As the 14th and 15th centuries unfold, Angkor shifts from a landscape of active temple building and hydraulic optimization to one of contraction, religious transformation, and eventual political repositioning. Many lines of evidence converge. Epigraphic records slow in the 14th century, LIDAR showing contracted habitation cores, and paleoclimatic proxies indicating greater variability in monsoon patterns, yet causality resists simple narratives. External pressures are clear: the rising Ayutthaya kingdom to the west, Cham incursions at various points, and long-distance trade that increasingly favored coastal ports all reshaped strategic incentives. Internally, a change in devotional focus from Hindu Brahmanical rites to Theravada Buddhism altered temple economics. Buddhist monks emphasized personal salvation over the temple-sponsored performance of royal divinity, shifting patronage patterns away from colossal stone projects. The hydraulic system that once bound the polity together may have become more brittle in the face of erratic rainfall. Too much water could destroy dikes, and too little could mean crop failure. The human consequences were profound. Populations relocated to more water-secure zones, elite sponsorship of distant projects faltered, and political authority reoriented toward coastal and riverine centers better positioned to exploit maritime trade. But the story of decline is not simply one of disaster, it is also a story of transformation. Many temples remained centers of pilgrimage and ritual, repurposed and revered even as their political contexts shifted. Local communities adapted. New centers of power emerged elsewhere, and some elements of Khmer culture persisted, metamorphosing into new forms. The cinematic image of a lone king leaving a smoking capital oversimplifies a long, complex process of institutional reconfiguration and social negotiation. Picture the last great procession down a causeway where the banners are fewer and the retinues thinner, yet the ritual is still performed because ritual itself sustains meaning even when power wanes. And in the end, there is a paradox. The very stones that testify to Angkor's ambition also anchor the memory of its decline, preserving a question more than an answer. We still don't know which combination of environmental stress, political miscalculation, and external pressure was decisive, or whether such a single decisive factor even existed in a process that unfolded over generations. The next mystery arrives as a single, unsettling sentence. The stones themselves keep secrets, carved faces, unfinished panels, and purposeful erasures that suggest revision, censorship, or rituals we cannot fully decode. Walk with me now along a ruined gallery where a mason's chisel has left a shallow line mid-figure, a hand half-formed as if the artist stopped, or was forced to stop, and imagine the decisions that made that cut. In some places you can see the original outlines lightly scratched into the sandstone before a deeper carving was taken. In others, figures have been deliberately defaced, noses or faces struck away in patterns suggestive of iconoclastic impulses. The chronological sweep of Angkor's sculptural program runs across centuries, early pre-Angkorian motifs morphing into the monumental classical style of the 12th century, and later being recarved or overlaid with Buddhist iconography when Theravada practice took hold. These palimpsests in stone are direct testimony to the political and religious shifts sweeping through the region. But they are also maddeningly mute on intent. Were certain images defaced because a conquering ruler sought to erase the memory of his predecessor, or because a ritual demanded a symbolic renewal? Did artisans adjust narratives mid-course as political fortunes changed? Or were entire reliefs repurposed for new temples as patronage shifted? The archaeological evidence is partial. Tool marks and microstratigraphy can show sequences of carving and reworking, but they rarely provide an explicit why. To some scholars, the deliberate erasures are clear signs of political iconoclasm, victors rewriting the past by striking down the faces of the old gods and kings. To others, the changes are pragmatic, driven by the longer life of stone than of political intention. Temples reused, rededicated, and adapted by subsequent generations who appropriated the sacred landscape for their own ritual needs. Another perspective sees a devotional economy in play. As religious practices shifted from one sect to another, the stone record was updated to align with new doctrinal demands, erasing heterodox imagery simply to make the sanctum conform. Still, the pattern does not always fit neat timelines. Some defacements predate known conflicts. Some, restored, panels occur during times of apparent stability. Picture an artisan grinding out a god's face under the dim light of an enclosure, while temple priests chant nearby. Imagine the political gossip in the courtyard, nobles debating whether to honor an old oath or to assert a new cult. And picture, too, the mythic overlay, villagers telling stories of stones that will not be carved because a spirit lives in the outline, or craftsmen who dream of unfinished hands that reach out at night. We still don't know whether these patterns represent conscious campaigns of memory control, ad hoc ritual adaptation, or a complex mix of both that resists tidy categorization. Another sentence-sized mystery: beneath the temples and towpath causeways, the soil archives whisper of diets, migrations, and diseases that might have shaped Angkor's population in ways the stones do not. Archaeobotanical and zooarchaeological studies, those careful recoveries of charred grains, fish bones, and tiny plant remains, are piecing together an image of daily life that complicates grand narratives. Rice, of course, is central. Both wet rice and dry field systems existed in the region, and micro-regional differentiation mattered. Phytolith and phytoclast studies show fields of intensely managed wet paddy alongside upland plots, suggesting a mixed strategy that could offer resilience against localized crop failure. But the assemblages also revealed dietary breadth. Freshwater fish species abound in middens, and shellfish remains near riverine sites hint at seasonal catch and trade in protein. Stable isotope analysis from human remains, bone collagen and tooth enamel, allows us to speak about geographical mobility and diet in surprising specificity. Who ate a fish-heavy diet versus who relied on terrestrial staples, who had access to traded foods like coconut starch or marine resources, and who might have grown up far from the capital. Early isotopic studies indicate that while many workers and residents were local to the Central Plain, some individuals show signatures of childhoods in other environments, coastal zones, upland forests, or even further afield, implying flows of people that match hypotheses of seasonal labor migration and specialist movement. Pathological data from skeletons, signs of healed fractures, wear on joints, and dental stress, fleshes out the human cost of labor, diet, and disease. There are indications of repetitive strain consistent with hauling and carving, and infectious markers that speak of crowding and sanitation challenges in denser districts. Taken together, these biological records complicate any romantic image of a monument-supported utopia. They suggest hard labor, uneven access to nutrition, and a mobile population whose life courses cross temple precincts, quarries, and riverine hubs. Now, the interpretative debates multiply. Do isotopic outliers indicate captive labor move long distances? Or do they reflect voluntary migration in search of opportunity? Are dietary differences proxies for social class, ethnic origin, or simply ecological access? And where diseases are visible, do they tell of episodic epidemics tied to climatic change, or of chronic health stresses endemic to dense living? Picture a burial in whose teeth is the chemistry of salt water far from the capital, or a joint worn away by decades of lifting heavy stones. Each such body is an archive and a question. We still don't know the full demographic structure of Angkor at its peak. How many were permanent residents? How many seasonal workers? And how mobile were the craftspeople who made the city what it was? There is a sentence-sized enigma that moves between the map and the sky. Angkor's urban plan seems to encode cosmological order, alignments, axes, and cardinal orientations that might reflect religious symbolism, astronomical observation, or the imprint of imperial ideology. Angkor Wat's 5 towers famously echoed the 5 peaks of Mount Meru, a symbolic cosmology central to Hindu-Buddhist thinking. Yet beyond metaphoric alignment, there are measurable geometries in the layout of temples, causeways, and reservoirs that invite a more analytical reading. Scholars have identified sidelines, axial orientations, and repeating ratios in temple placements that could indicate a master plan governed by sacred cosmology, or by practical surveying conventions, or by a mixture of both. The Khmer may have used simple surveying tools, ropes, sighting poles, and water levels, to achieve consistent orientation across multiple projects, but some of the alignments are precise enough to invite speculation that astronomical observations played a part: equinoctial alignments, solstitial markers, or sight lines that mark sunrise on significant religious days. One theory suggests that temple complexes functioned as a terrestrial calendar, integrating ritual events with seasonal agricultural cycles through orientation and visibility of celestial events. Another view argues that the axes are largely symbolic, chosen to assert the king's place in a divinely ordered cosmos, and that any astronomical precision is incidental or exaggerated by later interpreters. Yet a third perspective treats the plan as a hybrid. Sacred geometry was overlaid on practical topography, producing alignments that speak to both ritual timing and hydraulic optimization. The pragmatic hydroengineering needed to align reservoirs and channel gradients may have constrained temple placement, turning sacred intent into something mediated by landform realities. Picture a priest astronomer explaining to a king that a temple must sit both above flood level and on an axis that greets the rising sun on a sacred festival. Imagine the negotiation between divine symbolism and engineering pragmatism. And imagine the mythic image: the temple as a cosmic instrument tuned to the heavens, priests watching for the morning line of light to crown a statue in perfect, impossible alignment. We still don't know whether Angkor's planners were systematic astronomers, pragmatic surveyors, or divine legislators who weaved the three into a single imperial fabric. A short, sharp mystery. Angkor's peripheries, satellite temples, irrigation nodes, and village clusters, are far more populous and complex than early explorers imagined, and LIDAR has dramatically shifted our sense of scale. Yet how these many nodes related politically and economically remains fuzzy. 21st century airborne LIDAR has been a revelation, slicing through jungle canopies to reveal the traces of roads, embankments, and residential grids that earlier ground surveys missed. The method has shown that Angkor's inhabited footprint was vast, tens or even hundreds of square kilometers of urbanized and semi-urbanized space, containing house platforms, small shrines, and regular field systems connected to the greater hydraulic mesh. Suddenly, the image of Angkor as a single monumental core surrounded by negligible suburbs gives way to a sprawling, networked metropolis where nodes of production and ritual knit the countryside into a functioning whole. But a technological leap often complicates, rather than simplifies, interpretation. Now that we can see house platforms and street grids, questions arise about governance. Were peripheral nodes direct administrative extensions of the capital or semi-autonomous settlements paying tribute? Were markets dispersed, with many localized exchanges, or was there a central market economy funneled through temple redistribution? Archaeologists developing models of economic flow propose varying structures. One model emphasizes a tribute-based economy organized by temple elite institutions who redistributed goods, labor, and ritual obligations to maintain social order. Another emphasizes market integration, where a vibrant exchange among households, craft producers, and itinerant traders sustained urban life. Yet another model blends both, seeing temples as hubs that supported both ritual economies and market activity. The spatial data from LIDAR is granular, but it does not carry a label saying, "market here," or "tribute storehouse there." So researchers combine remote sensing with on-the-ground sampling of artifacts, phytoliths, and refuse to infer function. Even then, the social complexity can be obstinate. Picture a small platform near a canal. Was it a merchant's house, a pottery kiln, or a shrine to local spirits? Each has different implications for how centralized or distributed Angkor's economy was. We still don't know exactly how decision-making, taxation, and market activity worked at the scale revealed by LIDAR, whether the capital orchestrated the periphery in detail, or whether a multivalent economy emerged with nodes balancing autonomy and obligation. Consider a final thematic puzzle for now: the role of religion not just as belief but as administrative technology. How did the shift from Hindu state cults to Theravada Buddhism reorganize social obligations, temple economies, and elite legitimacy? Inscriptions and iconography show a clear movement over centuries. Early Khmer courts sponsored large-scale Hindu temples and the Devaraja cult, which sacralized kingship in a way that centralized both ritual and economic capital. Later, from roughly the 13th century onward, Theravada Buddhism, with its emphasis on monastic life and individual devotion, becomes more prominent across inscriptions and artistic programs. This is not a simple replacement, it is a protracted, partial, and regionally variegated process. But its consequences are profound. Hindu state temples were often patronized by kings who endowed land, labor, and revenue to maintain rituals that affirmed the king's sacred status. Those endowments functioned as both spiritual merit and economic stability. Land given to a temple became managed by temple institutions, creating enduring revenue streams. Theravada Buddhism, by contrast, traditionally discouraged large cultic endowments tied to state ideology, and instead favored monastic individuals who could be supported by lay patrons in a different relationship. That shift may have been destabilizing to the temple-based economic infrastructure that had underpinned monumental construction and hydraulic maintenance. It may, in other words, have undermined the economic logic that paid for waterworks and large-scale corvée projects. Yet other scholars caution against overstating this as a single causal mechanism. Religious transitions are often adaptive and can coexist with pre-existing institutions. Theravada monks sometimes occupied and reused Hindu temples, integrating the old sacred geographies into new practices. Picture a monk walking through a former royal shrine, reciting sutras where once a king performed rites, while local farmers continue to bring rice to maintain canals. The religious shift is both subtle and seismic, a change in liturgical emphasis, a shift in where spiritual authority was located, and a reconfiguration of patronage networks that reaches into the economy and the hydraulic system. We still don't know whether religious change was an initiator of institutional decline, a response to wider political and environmental stress, or simply one thread in a complex tapestry of transformation. Pause here as the sun moves across the high Cambodian sky and consider the human faces behind these problems. The anonymous stonecutters, the priests reciting liturgy at dawn, the markets humming with barter, and the rulers who balanced cosmology and grain. Each archaeological layer is a voice we strain to hear. The public inscriptions speak in regal, canonical languages that present a deliberately curated image. The bones and middens speak in a grittier, more proximate dialect. The landscapes carry patterns of engineering and abandonment like a palimpsest of decisions and chance. When 2 or 3 datasets point in the same direction, we gain confidence. When they diverge, the divergence itself becomes evidence. We still don't know the precise choreography of Angkorian life at peak scale, how labor, belief, commerce, and water were synchronized across seasons and generations to produce an urban organism that looks both deliberate and improvised. But we do know that the questions themselves, about control and ritual, about diet and movement, about orientation and meaning, are not merely academic. They touch on the perennial human concerns of survival, identity, and how organized societies respond to stress. Imagine, for a final image in this section, walking out from a temple at dusk, the last light catching a frieze where carved faces look down on you, and below, the water of a channel moving slow and inevitable. Feel the sense that the past is not finished with us. It waits in the grooves of stone and the chemistry of bone, offering up riddles to those patient enough to listen. We still don't know many things about Angkor, and that is the point. The unknown is not a hole in history, it is an invitation. We stand now at the end of this long walk through stone, water, and human breath, and it feels right to slow down, look back across the causeways we have crossed, and ask what the sum of these mysteries actually means for us. Why should the riddles of Angkor matter to you, to me, or to anyone alive with a curiosity for the past? The simplest answer is this: Angkor Wat and its surrounding city were not a single monument but a complex experiment in how humans organize themselves in the face of nature, ambition, and belief. The engineers who leveled embankments and carved gates, the carvers who blew life into sandstone, the priests who recited texts at dawn, and the farmers who worried over seed and rain, All of them were trying to solve the same enduring problem we still wrestle with today: how to build stable life in a world that refuses guarantees. In those stone and water decisions are echoes of our modern dilemmas: urban sustainability, the governance of shared resources, the layering of identity in multicultural polities, and the slow feedback loops between human systems and climate. To treat Angkor as merely exotic ornament is to miss the enormous human labor and intelligence encoded in the plain. To treat it as only a cautionary tale about collapse is equally reductive. It was also a place of astonishing innovation and vibrant cultural life. So what does that mean for us now? It means that every disputed sluice, every varnished relief, and every isotopic outlier is more than data. These are human fingerprints on the problem of living well with others and with the environment. When you gather the threads, hydraulics that could be both miracle and liability, reliefs that straddle record and ritual, labor systems that were both coercive and inventive, and religious shifts that reordered economies, you see a pattern of interplay rather than a single cause and effect chain. The durability of Angkor's stone temples allowed its memory to outlast the brittle perishable parts of its urbanism: timber houses, ephemeral markets, seasonal labor rosters. That fossilization of sacred architecture creates a bias in the archive. We are listening disproportionately to the language of kings and gods, while the everyday rhythms of common people speak in a softer register: bones and seeds, middens and soil marks, that we are only now learning to interpret. This mismatch explains why some of our most stubborn questions feel personal rather than technical. We want to know whether a king's decree could starve a village or whether weather could topple a dynasty. Those questions are really about agency and vulnerability, and they are resolved not by a single discovery but by a careful stitching together of climatic data, landscape archaeology, and human remains. The narrative that emerges is not melodramatic doom nor untroubled triumph. It is a mosaic of adaptive responses, contested power, and cultural creativity that eventually arrived at a new configuration when the old one strained. And yet there is wonder here that is not merely scenic. There is a human achievement in imagining and then shaping a landscape at the scale Angkor demonstrates. To cut canals that redirected floodwater across a plain, to choreograph stone facades that could hold myth and law in a single frame, to manage labor and logistics across generations, these are feats of planning and social organization that deserve admiration even as we interrogate their costs. Think of the barays as not only reservoirs but public statements about a society that believed it could order the elements and itself at once. Think of the reliefs as collective memory devices, arguments carved for posterity about who the people were and what they owed to their rulers and gods. When we walk among those stones now, when we let the fog lift off the moat and the sun glitter along a carved eyelid, we are encountering an argument about what human life should look like. An argument made by people with hopes, anxieties, and the same capacity to imagine futures we have. That ethical thread is what transmits Angkor's relevance. It asks us to reckon with how political authority uses spectacle and labor, how religion can both unite and reconfigure economies, and how the thin margin between resilience and collapse is managed by choices as much as by uncontrollable weather. To be human is to be both ordinary and audacious, and Angkor amplifies that duality. Ordinary in the sense that everyday tasks, rice transplanting, net mending, pot firing, made the city possible. Audacious in the sense that visionaries imagined temples that could speak to the cosmos and infrastructures that rearranged rivers to suit human needs. The interplay between the ordinary and the audacious is what makes some of our interpretive tensions productive. When scholars argue about whether the Khmer were hydraulic engineers, religious propagandists, or administrative centralizers, they are really debating emphasis, whether to privilege technology, ideology, or institutional capacity in explaining social phenomena. The truth is not one category but an overlapping set of capacities. The Khmer used technology and ritual as mutually reinforcing tools. A king who could command the erection of a baray also commanded narrative claims about holiness and legitimacy. A monastic teacher who reinterpreted ritual could slowly transform the economic substrate of temple patronage. These transformations are never unilateral. They ripple out through households, markets, and the soil itself. There is also humility in this story. the humility that comes from realizing how much remains beyond our reach and how provisional our reconstructions are. Every LIDAR map that reveals a previously unknown grid, every isotopic reading that tunes a migration story, and every carved face with a chipped nose invites new questions. Archaeology is, by its nature, dialogic. Each layer of new evidence opens a conversation with older interpretations rather than closing it. That dialogic quality is a virtue. It keeps the field alive with skepticism and imaginative hypotheses. It insists that the past cannot be bulldozed into simple narratives. When we admit, as scholars increasingly do, that we still do not know exactly how Angkor's hydraulic network was managed across centuries or precisely how religious change impacted labor obligations, we are not confessing ignorance so much as honoring the complexity of human systems. This honest humility is itself an ethical posture that academic inquiry should adopt more broadly, embracing uncertainty while methodically broadening our evidence basis. There is also a moral echo here about stewardship. Many of Angkor's mysteries have been preserved precisely because local practices, taboos, reverence, everyday customs, protected them in ways that modern institutional frameworks sometimes overlooked. Conversely, reckless looting, careless tourism, and short-sighted development threaten what remains to be learned. If the stones and soils are archives, then conservation is a mode of ethical listening. Protecting a temple corridor, a burial mound, or a house platform is not merely an act of heritage fetishism. It is a decision to preserve future knowledge about how people once made life possible in difficult circumstances. Modern planners and citizens should consider this when they weigh economic priorities against cultural and ecological preservation. If there is a lesson in Angkor that projects into our urban futures, it is that infrastructure, especially when entwined with political power, requires accountable stewardship across generations. Finally, there is an invitation implicit in every unresolved fact, to imagine anew. When a relief leaves a face unfinished, the gap is an opportunity to imagine the artist's hand mid-movement and to consider why the work stopped. When a sluice's groove is puzzlingly placed, it invites engineers and historians to reconstruct scenarios of water flow and social control. When isotopic signatures show a life spent partly at sea and partly inland, we are invited to imagine personal journeys, migration, marriage, or craft specialization that knitted distant places together. Each absence in the record is not just a hole, it is a prompt for curiosity and responsible exploration. Those prompts are democratic in spirit. They do not belong only to academics. They are for any of us who stand on a causeway at dawn and feel the chill of the past in our lungs. You do not need a doctorate to imagine a king watching sunrise over his beret, or a mason grinding a chisel just so. You need only to listen with patience and to value the evidence that remains. So what should you take with you when you leave Angkor's story behind? Walk away with both questions and compassion. Appreciate the human ingenuity on display and the delicate webs it depended upon. Recognize the arrogance in assuming a single explanation for complex social change. Prefer layered stories that accommodate multiple causalities. Hold on to wonder. Let the carved faces and flooded berets kindle awe, but temper that wonder with the rigors of evidence and the humility to accept uncertainty. And finally, be willing to protect what you encounter. The past is a fragile archive that grows more legible with care. These ruins, after all, are not monuments to a dead people but pages in a living conversation about how societies organize, sustain, and transform themselves. They are our mirrors as much as they are their monuments. Keep the images with you: the fog over the moat, the sun striking a carved eyelid, the hollow of an embankment, because they are not just picturesque backdrops. They are invitations to think differently about the present. If you close your eyes for a moment, imagine again the causeway at dawn, the air still and heavy with promise. Hear the distant rhythm of oars, the faint scraping of a chisel, the low murmur of voices negotiating water rights. Picture a child watching a temple being decorated and imagine that child growing up to be an engineer, a priest, or a potter, someone who will, in their lifetime, remake the world in subtle but consequential ways. That cycle of ordinary acts generating extraordinary monuments is what makes Angkor's mysteries not merely curiosities but templates for understanding human possibility. We will keep probing, testing, and listening. New methods will reveal more, and new hypotheses will arise. Some will stick, most will be revised, all will contribute to a more textured understanding. In the meantime, stand where the stones meet the sky and let the unanswered questions be not a source of frustration but of persistent wonder. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.